2. Hercule Poirot and the Necklace That Did Not Touch. The Neck Chapter 1. The Fall of the Swan. It was a humid and stifling afternoon in early June when Lady Agatha Carmichael fell to her death in the middle of the entrance hall of Thornwick Hall, under the watchful eyes of 6 people and a butler, too well trained to scream. A scream would have been useless, however. Lady Agatha wasn't moving. She was slumped eerily symmetrically on the checkered marble, her eyes open, her expression one of bewilderment rather than fear. The sherry glass she'd been holding had shattered next to her hand, and the only thing out of place was the pearl necklace that rested on the side of her shoulder, dangling awkwardly, as if it had never been attached to her neck in the first place. Lady Agatha, widow of the powerful industrialist Henry Carmichael, was a central figure in Surrey, a philanthropist, tireless hostess, and wielder of a tongue that could slice through reputations with the precision of a scalpel. That weekend she had gathered a carefully curated selection of guests to celebrate her 68th birthday, although some of those present knew, or thought they knew, that there was more to the occasion. Thornwick Hall, surrounded by rolling fields and sculpted box hedges, seemed like a place out of time. But even in its hushed grandeur, echoes of unseen tensions floated between its walls, and now, with the sudden death of its matriarch, that silence took on a new and dangerous dimension. Detective Inspector Alec Withers of the Dorking Police arrived 30 minutes later. Notified by one of the maids on the office phone, he examined the body with forced respect and the expression of someone who would rather be dealing with a minor shoplifting. He found no signs of violence or obvious injuries, only the odd slippage of the necklace, a real pearl necklace, they confirmed, out of its natural place. Allergies? Did her heart fail? He murmured as the local nurse, Miss Kelsey, confirmed that Lady Agatha was no longer breathing. "There's no foaming at the mouth, no sign of convulsions," the nurse said, adjusting her glasses with a nervous tremor. "But the colour, that's not just a faint, Inspector." The butler, Barnes, intervened with his usual discretion. "My lady complained this morning of a slight pressure in her chest, but she insisted on continuing with the evening." "And the necklace?" the inspector asked. Barnes bowed slightly. "Lady Agatha insisted on wearing it whenever she had important visitors. It's a family piece. However, this time it wasn't wearing it when we found her." "Wasn't it on?" the inspector repeated, frowning. "Then why is it there by the shoulder?" "Ah." A high-pitched, masculine and decidedly foreign voice chimed in from the doorway. "That, mon ami, is precisely the wrong question." Everyone turned. In the doorway stood a short man with a perfectly waxed moustache, a light grey suit without a single wrinkle, and a handkerchief folded with mathematical precision in his jacket pocket. He carried a thin cane and wore an expression of refined disdain. "And you are," said the inspector. "Allow me to introduce myself. Hercule Poirot. I've been invited by Lady Agatha as an observer, or, in her own words, as a decorative element who knew when to keep quiet and when to ask very awkward questions." It seems the time for questions has come. Hours later, Poirot sat in the library, the light from a reading lamp shining on his perfectly polished shoes. The inspector had authorized the preliminary questioning of those present, and Poirot, ever methodical, had begun to make his list. There were 6 guests present at the mansion, Mr. Philip Carmichael, Lady Agatha's youngest son, a pale-faced, shifty-eyed literary editor, recently returned from Paris after several years of absence. Miss Evelyn March, a young writer whom Lady Agatha had been sponsoring for a year. Her novel, The Voice of Silence. He had been a finalist for a major award, and his relationship with the matriarch was close. Too close, some said. Reverend Giles Pratt, chaplain of the local parish, with an almost theatrical calm, and a shared history with the Carmichael family for decades. Mrs. Lydia Carmichael, daughter-in-law of Lady Agatha, widow of her eldest son, who had died the previous year in a car accident. Serious, elegant, and always impeccably polite, Mr. Benedict Darling, the family lawyer and long-time friend of Henry Carmichael. He frequently visited the mansion on estate matters. Miss Iris Lane, a distant cousin of Lady Agatha, recently arrived from America, jovial, direct, and clearly uncomfortable in the protocol-laden British environment. Poirot scanned each name and, underneath, added his own mental note. Everyone has something to gain, and everyone seems to have already lost something. Finally, he looked back at the small notebook where he had written a single sentence, firmly underlined. The necklace was there, but it wasn't touching the neck. He sighed softly. Yes, he murmured to himself, it's a very delicate affair, and the mystery of the necklace that didn't touch the neck had just begun. Chapter 2. Echoes Beneath the Surface. Breakfast the next day was served in the conservatory, a large room with glass walls overlooking the camellia garden. Despite the sun softly filtering through the windows, the atmosphere was as thick as an English soup. Everyone present avoided mentioning the previous afternoon's events, as if death could be dispelled by silence. But Poirot, impeccably dressed in an ivory linen suit and wearing a dragonfly tie clip, didn't allow the tension to slide under the rug. Silence, mes amis, he said, neatly stirring his cup of hot chocolate, is often more revealing than words. Philip Carmichael, sitting across from him, looked down at his unsweetened coffee. His fingers tapped nervously on the table. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. We're all simply dismayed. Exactly, replied Poirot. Honest, dismay is rarely accompanied by such restraint. Lady Lydia, at Philip's side, intervened in a calm voice. Not all of us express grief in the same way. Some prefer to maintain composure. Very well, madame. Poirot nodded slightly. And what about the necklace? The butter knife stopped, halfway in Iris Lane's hand. The necklace? What necklace? The pearl one, Poirot replied, without taking his eyes off his perfectly cut roll. The one the butler said Lady Agatha always wore on special occasions. The one witnesses said appeared near her shoulder, not on her neck. Reverend Pratt cleared his throat uncomfortably. Maybe it came loose. The zipper, sometimes. No. Poirot interrupted gently but firmly. It didn't loosen. It came off, deliberately. The statement hung in the air like a fly trapped in amber. All eyes sought refuge in their plates, in the garden, anywhere other than the inquisitive figure of the Belgian detective. Poirot said no more. Instead, he stood up with his ivory-headed cane and asked with impeccable courtesy to see the butler. Barnes received him in the servants' lounge, a room of exposed brick and scented with Earl Grey tea. His posture was that of a retired military man, erect, precise, unadorned. Poirot observed him for a moment in silence. "Barnes, when you found Lady Agatha, where exactly were you?" "To the right of the hall, monsieur. I had gone to fetch Miss Lane's coat. She had just mentioned that she was feeling cold." "And did you hear anything?" "Just the faint sound of breaking glass." "I went inside immediately." "Who was the first to arrive?" "I think young Mr. Philip. He was just on the stairs." Poirot nodded, quickly making notes in his notebook. "Tell me, had you seen the necklace on Lady Agatha that afternoon?" Barnes took a second longer than necessary to respond. "No. I noticed it on the console this morning, but I didn't see her put it on. I didn't see it around her neck when she served the sherry to the guests either." "And why didn't he wear it? Do you think Barnes narrowed his eyes?" "Milady never put on the necklace without making sure it was perfectly aligned. And I'm afraid this time, monsieur, something had you distracted." "Something? Or someone?" the butler corrected with studied neutrality. Poirot then went upstairs to the deceased's private office, guided by Barnes. The room was a miniature museum of a life ruled by order. Every object was in its place, every frame perfectly straight. In the centre of the desk, an unenveloped letter seemed to have been placed with great care. Poirot bent over it. It was a letter signed by Lady Agatha, addressed to her lawyer, Benedict Arling. In it, Lady Agatha formally requested an urgent review of her will, citing new personal circumstances and discoveries that completely alter my previous intentions. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, willpower is fertile ground for greed, isn't it?" He turned, scanning the library of books. Among the volumes one stood out slightly. Pulling it aside, he discovered a compartment behind a false panel. Inside, a small ebony chest was locked. Poirot didn't force it. Instead, he put the book back in its place, as if he hadn't seen anything. Then he left the office with the same deliberate gait with which he had entered. On the gallery, the sun shone brightly, but to Poirot, every corner of Thornwick Hall seemed plunged in shadow. "Virtuality," he murmured to himself as he slowly descended the stairs, "always hides where you least look for it." And I knew that sooner or later someone would try to take her to the grave. Along with the necklace. Chapter 3. The Writer and the Mirror. The morning dragged on, as if Thornwick Hall itself refused to cast off the sombre veil that tragedy had imposed. Poirot, after a short walk through the garden hedges, asked to speak to Miss Evelyn March, the young writer, on the terrace by the Stone Lion fountain. Evelyn arrived with a light coat draped over her shoulders and a leather-bound notebook under her arm. Her expression was pale but serene, as if she had spent the night practicing calculated composure. She sat down opposite Poirot with measured, almost theatrical movements. "Monsieur Poirot," he said with an air of ceremony, "I suppose you wish to ask me about Lady Agatha. I will tell you at once. I admired her profoundly. Naturally, mademoiselle, and no doubt she held you in high regard as well. She publicly supported you, even when many doubted the worth of your first novel." Evelyn smiled with a barely perceptible tinge of pride. "She was generous with me, yes, but also demanding. She didn't tolerate mistakes or weaknesses. No secrets, Evelyn," blinked, surprised by the precision of the question. "Lady Agatha knew everything," he said in a lower voice. "She listened more than she spoke. If you trusted her with something, you'd better also be prepared for her to use it when the time came. So, tell me, mademoiselle." Poirot crossed his legs, resting his hands on his walking stick. "Do you think anyone here was afraid of her?" The writer looked down at her notebook. Her fingers caressed the leather edge as if trying to find words in the silence. "We all owed him something, and some feared him even more for that. You, for example. I owed her my career, but I also felt trapped. I'd started writing a new novel, something more personal. Lady Agatha insisted on reading the first few chapters. And what it did, you think? He said if I published it, it would destroy my reputation, that certain stories should remain untold." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "What did those chapters contain, mademoiselle?" Evelyn hesitated. A character very similar to one of this weekend's guests, and he didn't portray him kindly. "And who was that character?" "I'd rather not say," she said firmly. "Not yet." Poirot accepted the refusal with a slight bow, although his gaze registered every nuance of the young woman's face. "Very well, mademoiselle, but know that sometimes fiction reveals truths that reality tries to hide." Shortly after, Poirot headed to the portrait room. Iris Lane was standing there, gazing at the oil painting of a Carmichael ancestor with an expression somewhere between curiosity and bewilderment. "There's something unsettling about him, don't you think?" Iris said without turning around, as if he were judging us. "Many paintings do that, but only a few are right," Poirot replied gently. "Did you know Lady Agatha well?" "I'd seen her 3 times in my life. This was the 4th. I never thought it would be the last. However, he showed up at Thornwick Hall just before your birthday." "Why?" Iris shrugged. "I received a letter from you inviting me. You said you wanted to sort out some family matters." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "Family matters?" He didn't specify, but he mentioned that it might be important to me, and to someone else. "Anyone else?" Iris bit her lip. "I think he meant Philip. Did you have a close relationship?" "I met him in New York 5 years ago, at an art gallery. He never mentioned his mother. It was a brief thing, and it broke up for reasons I don't fully understand. And now, suddenly, we're both here. It can't be a coincidence." Poirot was silent for a moment, as if his thoughts were walking before his words. "Lady Agatha was a formidable strategist, mademoiselle. If she gathered you here, it's because she knew something needed to be revealed. Perhaps she didn't expect to die before doing so." Later, Poirot requested access to Lady Agatha's room. Etienne was accompanied by Inspector Withers, still sceptical, but no longer blocking his way. The room was as tidy as the study, curtains neatly drawn, cushions aligned with geometric precision. On the bedside table, Poirot noticed a small mirror with a mother-of-pearl handle. He lifted it and examined it closely. A fine layer of dust covered the back, except for one oval area, as if it had been recently held in a gloved hand. A thin sliver of paper was caught on the edge of the mirror frame. Poirot carefully removed it. It was barely legible, but one word was still visible: cancellation. The Belgian pursed his lips. A letter, a legal document, a threat. She put the mirror back in its place. Then she walked to the dresser, where she found an unlabeled bottle of perfume. She uncorked it and sniffed cautiously. Her nose wrinkled. "This isn't perfume, Inspector. Poison? I don't know yet. But if it is, it wasn't meant to be disguised. It was meant to be mistaken for something familiar. And that, my dear, is very British." On his way out, Poirot didn't go to the garden or the dining room. He walked toward the south gallery, where the evening light hit the glass at an almost perfect angle. There he paused, folded his arms and murmured, "Too many secrets and an elegant crime, not because of its method, but because of its motivation." And as the clocks at Thornwick Hall struck 4 o'clock, the mystery of the necklace, the silenced novel, and the unexpected invitation began to intertwine in the web of small grey cells. Chapter 4. Vrahor, Shadows in the Inheritance. The day progressed with measured steps, as if Thornwick Hall were breathing heavily between each hour. Poirot, after a brief solitary lunch, requested a private conversation with the family lawyer, Mr. Benedict Arling. He received him in the reading room, an austere room with the smell of old leather and poorly concealed pipe smoke. Arling waited, by the fireplace, standing with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of calculated reserve. "Monsieur Poirot," he greeted with a slight bow, "I thought you'd come to see me sooner or later." "The precision of your intuition is admirable, monsieur," Poirot replied courteously. "I understand that Lady Agatha wrote you a letter shortly before her death." Arling nodded slowly. "Yes, I received it yesterday morning, as I was already on my way here. He asked me to privately discuss some urgent changes to his will. He didn't specify the details, but he did make it clear that it was a substantial change." "And did you have the opportunity to speak with her?" "No. When I arrived, Lady Agatha had already retired to her room. Barnes said she was feeling unwell that afternoon, and would prefer to leave the matter until the following morning." "Funny," Poirot commented, raising an eyebrow. "Because she wasn't alive that morning." "That's right," Arling admitted, lowering his gaze for a moment. "I deeply regret not having insisted." Poirot watched him silently, allowing the emptiness between words to weigh heavily. "Can you tell me, sir, who the heirs were in the previous will?" "Of course," Arling said, once again assuming his professional air. "Philip Carmichael, as the legitimate son, would receive the majority of the inheritance. Mrs. Lydia Carmichael was also on the books with a lifetime pension. Evelyn March would receive a lump sum as a thank you for her company and literary collaboration. Thornwick Hall would eventually be given to a trust for educational purposes, as per Lady Agatha's express wish. Iris Lane was not listed at all." Poirot nodded slowly, then leaned over to the nearby desk and ran a finger along its surface. "And do you believe that any of these beneficiaries had reason to wish Lady Agatha dead before these changes were implemented?" Arling didn't respond immediately. His lips moved, but he didn't utter any words for a few seconds. "I'll just say that wills stir up primitive passions. There are those who see a change not only as a loss, but as a betrayal." Poirot rose with a slight bow. "Thank you, Mr. Arling. Your words, though cautious, have spoken volumes." In the next corridor, Poirot met Reverend Giles Pratt, who was silently leafing through a book, as if he pretended not to have been listening. Poirot stopped in front of him. "Monsieur le Curé, do you believe in the redemption of those who commit crimes for fear of losing their place in the world?" The Reverend gently closed the book. "I believe in redemption, Monsieur Poirot, but I also believe that some sins are committed with such calculation, that remorse comes too late." Poirot nodded, his eyes never leaving the clergyman's weather-beaten face. "And Lady Agatha, what sin could have touched her?" The Reverend hesitated. Before answering, pride, the desire to control everything, including the lives of those you claim to protect. Poirot bowed goodbye and descended the stairs to the greenhouse. He needed to think, not with facts, but with impressions. There, surrounded by ferns, lemon trees, and the constant murmur of water, he mentally reviewed the details. The letter to Arling. The will has not yet been modified. The necklace that appeared without touching the neck. The perfume without a label, with a scent that wasn't really one. The word cancellation, hidden in a mirror, and an unfinished novel that perhaps said too much. While I was meditating, Lydia Carmichael appeared. Her gait was serene, but her gaze carried a latent storm. She approached with the determination of someone who has decided to no longer avoid questions. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I am not a woman who hides behind silence. I would like to speak with you." "Of course, madame. About what?" "About what really happened last year, when my husband, Jonathan Carmichael, died in that car accident." Poirot watched her sharply. There was something restrained in her tone, a confession that didn't ask for permission. "Was it an accident?" he asked gently. "Yes," Lydia replied, "but it wasn't by chance. Jonathan was driving under pressure, hounded by an ultimatum that left him no escape." "On whose behalf?" "From his mother," Lydia said without hesitation. Lady Agatha discovered something about him, something she threatened to reveal to the entire family, unless he severed his ties with a certain someone. A woman abroad. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Was that threat recent? No. It happened months before her death. But since then, Lady Agatha had begun rewriting every thread of the family legacy. And I knew, we all knew, that something was coming. And you, madame, were you afraid of him?" Lydia took a deep breath, her silhouette silhouetted against the green backdrop of the greenhouse. "No, but I knew that if she disappeared, someone else would be responsible for imposing another kind of punishment." Poirot stood motionless for a few seconds. Then he spoke in a low voice. "Punishment always comes, but it doesn't always come from where you think it will." And as Lydia walked away into the shadows, Poirot looked back at the sky through the fogged-up glass. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered. The final blow was still missing to make them fit together. That blow, I knew, was getting closer. Chapter 5. The door no one knocked on. The afternoon was beginning to fade into coppery hues and shadows, blanketing Thornwick Hall in a stillness that seemed suppressed, like a breath before a confession. Poirot, after his conversation with Lydia Carmichael, retired to his rooms, not to rest, but to think. He wasn't the kind of detective who chased footprints in wet earth or bloodstains on curtains. He waited, he watched, he listened. It was there, at his temporary desk, arranging his notes with geometric meticulousness, that Barnes knocked on the door. "Pardon the interruption, Monsieur Poirot. Inspector Withers wishes to see you in the East Wing." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Has something happened?" "Mr. Philip Carmichael has requested to speak with you, in the music room." Poirot closed his notebook carefully. A curious place for such a serious exchange. The music room was a long room with high ceilings, green velvet curtains, and a black grand piano that looked more like a monument than an instrument. Philip stood beside the sheet music, his shoulders tense and his expression one of internal struggle. "Thank you for coming, sir," he said bluntly. "I need to clarify a few things before you jump to the wrong conclusions." "On what subject, Mr. Carmichael?" "About my mother, about her character, and about why many here are relieved she's dead." Poirot remained motionless, only nodding with a slight turn of his head. Philip began to walk, as if words were easier, in motion. Lady Agatha wasn't an evil woman, but she was ruthless. She didn't just help, she also possessed. She controlled those she touched, sometimes with money, sometimes with secrets. She had a folder, literally, where she wrote things down. Conversations, details, even documents. "Where is that folder, Philip?" Hesitated. "I don't know, but I'm sure it exists. I saw a page once. It was addressed to me. A copy of a letter I had sent from Paris to a friend. I mentioned a loan in it, something minor. She kept it. She never mentioned it to me directly, but she used it later to get me to return to England. She blackmailed me, with perfect politeness. And what happened when he returned?" Philip laughed, bitterly. "He made me his secretary, a son relegated to the role of assistant. And yet I thought I could win something back, maybe his respect, or at least a part of the inheritance." Poirot watched without interrupting. "But 2 days ago," Philip continued, "she told me she was going to change the will. She said that everything I'd done didn't make up for what she called the mistake in Paris, that she'd reconsidered, that her legacy should go to cleaner hands. And what did you answer?" Philip stopped, staring at Poirot. "I told him I'd regret it, that no one can build a life on threats, that even the tallest towers fall when they lose respect for their foundations." Poirot looked at him silently. Then he spoke softly. "Monsieur, where exactly were you when Lady Agatha fell?" Philip swallowed. "On the stairs, I swear. I heard the glass break. I ran. I saw her body already on the floor. I saw the necklace. But I didn't touch it. No one touched it." Poirot approached the piano slowly. He placed a finger on the keys, letting a single minor chord resonate softly. "One last question. Was the door to the north gallery locked?" Philip frowned. "Which door?" "The one that leads to the private corridor, behind the family rooms." "That door?" "No, I don't think so. It's never used. No one goes in there." Poirot smiled. "That's exactly why, sir. That's exactly why." That evening, as the house was closing, Poirot walked down that forgotten corridor. It was narrow, with dark, wooden skirting boards and small windows overlooking the back gardens. There he found the door in question. It wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully fitted. He entered without making a noise, The corridor led him to a small landing from which he could partially see the hall where Lady Agatha fell. From that vantage point, a person could observe without being seen. Poirot bent down. At the edge of the floorboards, he saw a small mark of displaced dust. A thin line, a minimal trace. As if a shoe toe had been turned on its heel, the killer, he thought, didn't approach from the front. He didn't cross the hallway with everyone watching. The killer was here, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike unseen. And then the necklace. Poirot sat up slowly. He closed the door again carefully, as if he didn't want to disturb the memory of the crime. At that point, I didn't need any more physical evidence. What I had was even more valuable, a logical construct, an invisible web woven with psychology and behavior. As he walked back down the quiet corridor, he muttered, "The killer didn't need to touch the neck, just the pride. And that, in this house, they all wear it on their sleeves." Chapter 6. Traces of a Motive. The next day the weather dawned grey and heavy, as if the atmosphere knew the truth was beginning to crack the masks at Thornwick Hall. Poirot ate breakfast with his usual elegance, letting the others notice, or guess, that something had changed in his expression. He offered no explanations, but the way he scrutinized every gesture, every exchange of glances during breakfast, put everyone in a state of polite unease. Mid-morning, Poirot asked to see Iris Lane, this time in the greenhouse. The young American woman arrived with a firm stride, wearing an ivory dress and a coat that was too light for the weather. Her hair was carelessly tied back, and although her usual demeanour was lively, there was a latent tension in her face. I suppose this is another of your subtle deduction conversations, Monsieur Poirot," she said, sitting down opposite him. "No, mademoiselle," he replied with a slight smile. "Today I only wish to listen. You are the only one here whose story has not yet been fully told." Iris raised her eyebrows. "What do you want to know? Let's start with the reason Lady Agatha contacted you. You said you received a letter. Do you have it?" She took an envelope from her inside coat pocket. She handed it over without hesitation. Poirot opened it carefully. The paper was thick, with Thornwick Hall letterhead. The handwriting was firm but elegant. "Dear Iris, the time has come to repair what was broken long before your birth. If you still have the courage to know who you truly are, come to Thornwick Hall for my birthday. What you discover could change everything." With affection, Agatha C. Poirot read the letter twice, then raised his eyes. "Mademoiselle, did you know that there was a possibility that Lady Agatha was your aunt?" Iris looked down. "I suspected. My mother never talked about her childhood. She only told me that she was sent to America when she was 17, and that she never looked back." "And why did you think this letter had anything to do with that?" "Because my middle name is Agnes, the same as Lady Agatha's, and because when my mother died, I found a photo in her trunk. It was Thornwick Hall, with a note on the back, 'The house that denied me.'" Poirot nodded slowly. "So, you came here not as a mere guest, but as a potential heiress." "I didn't come for the money, Monsieur Poirot. I came for the story. But history, mademoiselle, can be even more dangerous than inheritance." Poirot returned to his room with the letter in his pocket. He sat down by the window and began to piece together the loose threads in his mind. Lady Agatha had discovered something, not only about Iris, but perhaps also about Jonathan, her deceased son. Was it possible that her eldest son knew of Iris's hidden relationship? Had he tried to protect her or hide her? And then another question arose. What if the will Lady Agatha was going to change didn't just redistribute money, but truths? At that hour, Inspector Withers requested a private meeting with Poirot in the library. With a worried expression, he held out a folded sheet of paper. "We found this morning in one of Lady Agatha's desk drawers. It was among her personal papers, but unsigned and undated." Poirot unfolded the document. It was a typewritten sheet. As he read it, his right eyebrow slowly rose. "I, Agatha Carmichael, hereby declare my intention to recognize Iris Lane as the legitimate heir of my sister Margaret, who died in 1896. My conscience can no longer tolerate this prolonged silence. I wish to make amends to the extent possible for the error committed in removing Margaret from the Carmichael family because of an unapproved pregnancy. Iris must know the truth. Philip will get his fair share. But the blood cannot be ignored." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. "The motivation for the crime is no longer ambiguous, Inspector. It's twofold: inheritance and blood." Withers frowned. "Do you think it was Philip?" "I don't know yet. But the killer didn't kill out of rage. He killed out of calculation, out of opportunity. And the necklace? Ah, that damned necklace," Poirot murmured. "It no longer symbolizes elegance. It symbolizes possession. Lady Agatha took it off. Or someone did for her, not out of carelessness, but as a symbolic gesture. As if, in her last moments, she no longer wished to bear the weight of her authority." Poirot stood up, walked slowly to the bookshelf, and touched the spine of a book without opening it. "Now, there's one last piece missing. The folder. The one that held the secrets. It has to exist. And whoever hid it is also afraid I'll find it." "And what will he do?" Withers asked. Poirot turned with a slight smile. "What Hercule Poirot always does, monsieur. Gather everyone together and force the guilty party to look in the mirror of their own actions. As I left the library, the sky was beginning to darken. The air was heavy. The revelation was approaching, like an impending storm that couldn't be stopped. And Poirot, he already knew the killer wasn't just someone with a motive. It was someone who had not touched the necklace. Because I didn't need to. He just had to make sure no one else knew who it belonged to." Chapter 7. The Silence of the Pearls. Dinner that evening was a tense and silent affair. Spoons and knives moved with mechanical precision across the plates, but eyes barely met. The news of the document found by Poirot and Inspector Withers, though not officially announced, had begun to filter into the corridors, like a perfume too strong to ignore. Iris avoided eye contact. Philip looked paler than ever. Lydia maintained her dignified bearing, but her jaw was tight. Evelyn March, normally reserved, watched with an expression that oscillated between disbelief and suspicion. Reverend Giles Pratt blessed the meal with a cracking voice, as if the words he spoke weighed more than ever. Poirot, for his part, ate with absolute calm. Only after finishing dessert did he wipe his lips with a neatly folded napkin and stand up. "My dear friends," he said in a gentle but firm tone, "I'm afraid the moment of truth has arrived. Tomorrow morning I will summon you all to the Blue Room. But tonight I will ask each of you one last question. Just one. The answer, or the way you give it, will tell me what I still need to know." There were no protests, just a thick atmosphere, like fog over a dark lake. The first was Evelyn March. Poirot received her in the library, amid long shadows and the scent of aged paper. "Miss March," he said bluntly, "were you in love with Philip Carmichael?" Evelyn opened her mouth and closed. It took her a few seconds to speak. "I admired him, the way you admire a complex character. He inspired me and disappointed me. I wrote about him before I realized it hurt to do so. And Lady Agatha knew? Yes. He warned me. He told me that literature should remain on paper, that Philip wasn't, a man who could belong to anyone." Poirot nodded, satisfied, not because he believed the answer, but because it had been given with more truth than Evelyn herself realized. Then came Reverend Pratt. He entered with the slow gait of someone already burdened with too much silence. "Monsieur le Curé," Poirot began, "did you ever confess to Lady Agatha anything that is relevant now?" The Reverend hesitated. He looked down. Lady Agatha wasn't a believer in the strictest sense, but she asked me for moral advice. And yes, she told me about her sister. She told me that she had sinned more out of pride than malice, that her greatest punishment would be having to correct a mistake without being forgiven. "And you forgave her?" "It wasn't my place, but I did understand her, and that sometimes is harder. Lydia Carmichael was the third." "Madame," said Poirot, "if Lady Agatha had asked you to accept Iris as part of the family, would you have done so? Not out of obligation, but perhaps out of compassion. I've lost a husband, a son I never had, and the chance to rebuild something. Iris isn't my enemy, but I'm not her protector either." Poirot didn't reply. He just watched her leave, her dignity intact, but her shoulders a little more slumped. When Iris entered, Poirot looked at her with a mixture of compassion and surgical attention. "Mademoiselle Lane, what did you expect to find here?" "A root, a word that would confirm that I wasn't just a shadow, that my mother wasn't an embarrassment, that I belong. What if someone had to die for that to happen? I don't care, Mr. Poirot. I didn't ask him that." Iris looked at him, a lump in her throat. "I expected nothing but the truth, and what I found was silence. Silence on every wall, as if my story were an uncomfortable secret for everyone." Poirot bowed slightly. "Thank you, mademoiselle." Philip was last. He walked in slowly, defeated before he'd even begun. "Monsieur Carmichael," said Poirot, "did you know that Iris is your cousin?" Philip stopped without sitting down. "I suspected as much. My mother dropped hints, her disdain for past mistakes, her references to a banished young woman. I wasn't stupid, but I was cowardly. I didn't do anything. I just waited for her to speak. And if Lady Agatha had officially recognized Iris, what would you have done? I don't know. Maybe I would have fought. Maybe I would have resigned myself. But the truth is, I'll never know. Will I?" Poirot looked at him carefully. "Perhaps so, monsieur. Perhaps he still knows." That night, Poirot stayed awake. He reread every note, every word, every silence, and in his mind one image returned again and again, the necklace on her shoulder, the pearls separated, the weight that no longer supported a neck, but a story. At 3 a.m, he finally spoke in a low voice, as if only his grey cells should hear him. "That's it. Voilà." The crime wasn't about money or revenge. It was about control. And tomorrow, in the light of day, the control would end. Chapter 8. The Blue Room. Dawn arrived with a thick mist enveloping the gardens of Thornwick Hall, as if the mansion itself refused to show its face to the new day. At 9 o'clock sharp, Barnes announced that the Blue Room was ready. The guests, one by one, were led inside with almost ceremonial silence. The room, with its indigo silk walls and gilt mouldings, had been the setting for countless social receptions. But today, under the watchful eye of a portrait of Lady Agatha in her youth, it had become a courtroom. Poirot stood waiting in front of the fireplace, his hands folded on his walking stick, his expression as serene as it was impenetrable. To his right, Inspector Withers was nervously flipping through a small notebook. All the suspects were present: Philip, Lydia, Iris, Evelyn, Reverend Pratt, and Barrister Arling. No one spoke. No one dared to sit down until Poirot gestured for them. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began in a firm but gentle voice, "this meeting is not for speculation. It's for revelation. I have reconstructed what happened, not only through physical evidence, but through the logic of facts and hearts." He paused, allowing the silence to settle heavily. Lady Agatha Carmichael didn't die of natural causes, nor was she the victim of a sudden reaction, as the inspector initially suggested. She was poisoned, yes, but not crudely. Not with an exotic poison, but with a familiar one she herself would have accepted without suspicion. With a gesture, Poirot showed a small translucent bottle. This contained a massage oil that Lady Agatha used daily to calm her nerves. It was replaced very discreetly with a solution containing a derivative of digitalis, enough to induce cardiac arrest in someone of her age and condition. There was a collective sigh. Poirot continued. And who could have had access to that bottle? Someone familiar with her routine. Someone who knew her habits. Someone who didn't need to force anything. And here comes the most revealing detail. The necklace. Everyone looked at him. Lady Agatha wasn't wearing the necklace when she fell. It appeared beside her, perfectly intact, but not on her neck. Because someone put it there afterward, like a symbol, like a way of saying, "This woman is no longer in control." Poirot approached the portrait. "And now, mes amis, I will tell you what really happened." He turned to Evelyn March. "Mademoiselle, your novel. You wrote a story that featured a character based on Lady Agatha. It portrayed her as a cruel manipulator. Isn't that true?" Evelyn looked down. "It was fiction, but based on realities that I couldn't ignore." Poirot nodded. "She read your manuscript and told you to destroy it. You didn't. She threatened to sue your publisher for veiled libel. That night you entered her room. You replaced the oil. And you waited, not out of hatred, out of hurt pride, out of fear, out of helplessness. "That's not true!" Evelyn jumped up. I never touched her." "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot approached delicately. "You left a note without realizing it. The word cancellation caught in the mirror frame. A sheet of paper from your notebook, isn't it? Same paper, same font from your typewriter." Evelyn stepped back. "It was a draft of a scene I was writing. It has nothing to do with... But it has everything to do with it. Because you didn't just feel humiliated, you felt eliminated, like a character losing their voice. And that night, the temptation to silence Lady Agatha was stronger than prudence. The silence became absolute." "But," Poirot continued gravely, "you weren't the one who put the collar on. That symbolic action came later, and it belongs to someone else, the real culprit." Everyone turned around, confused. Poirot walked slowly to the centre of the room. "Because, mes amis, Evelyn tried to poison her. But poison wasn't enough. Lady Agatha survived the first contact. She felt ill, yes, but she resisted. What killed her was one more dose, added to the sherry she drank just before she fell." He paused, looking directly at Philip Carmichael. "You knew about the oil. You saw it in her things. You knew Evelyn had touched it. And when Lady Agatha decided, in the end, not to sign the will amendment and sent it back unchanged, you understood that this was your last chance." Philip tensed. Iris looked at him with growing horror. He poured her the sherry. He knew something was weakening her, and he made sure to complete the job. He placed the necklace as a way to close the circle. The mother who possessed everything. Dead without her emblem of power. Philip stood up. His voice was barely a whisper. "She destroyed everything. She controlled every choice, every relationship. She turned me into a reflection of her disappointment, and they expected me to accept it?" Poirot nodded sadly. "No one expects injustice to be accepted, but justice isn't built on death." "Inspector," Withers stepped forward. "Mr. Carmichael, I must ask you to accompany me." Philip couldn't resist. He only gave Iris one last look, a look that held no hatred, only the awareness of having crossed a threshold from which he could no longer return. And so, in the blue room, where so many truths had been elegantly hidden, silence returned, but this time it was peace. Chapter 9. The Invisible Legacy. Thornwick. Hall breathed a different silence. Not the silence of fear or bewilderment, but the silence that comes after a storm. Slow, damp, filled with invisible debris. The blue drawing-room had been cleared. Lady Agatha's portrait seemed younger in the new light of morning, as if death had restored some of the innocence she never displayed in life. Poirot stood alone by the fireplace. His fingers ran over the handle of his walking stick, not out of nervousness, but out of rhythm. The solution to the case had been logical, but not simple. Evelyn March had desired the crime. She had initiated it without actually carrying it out. Philip Carmichael, burdened by years of resentment, had completed it with the precision of a wounded son still seeking validation from the woman he had killed. And yet, Poirot did not feel triumphant. Inspector Withers strode in. "Carmichael has confessed," he said. "He hasn't denied anything, although he blames Evelyn for opening the door. He insists that without her, nothing would have happened. "Ah, the old story of moral nudges," Poirot murmured. "One begins with a poisoned desire, another turns it into action, and both end up trapped in the same broken mirror. What will you do with Evelyn? Nothing. That decision isn't mine to make. But I doubt I'll ever write with the same pen again. A soul that harbours guilt, Monsieur Withers, never writes in indelible ink." Hours later, Poirot found Iris Lane in the boxwood garden. She walked slowly, as if each step marked a farewell. She held in her hand the letter from Lady Agatha she had shown him days before, neatly folded. "Are you leaving now, mademoiselle?" asked Poirot in a gentle tone. "Yes. I have nothing else to do here. The story is over." Poirot shook his head with a slight smile. "Oh, no. Begin. Lady Agatha, for all her faults, tried to make amends, and that attempt, though truncated, opens up a possibility. You have Carmichael blood, and now also something else. An inheritance, perhaps, but even more valuable. A story. Not hers, but yours. You write, don't you?" Iris looked at him in surprise. "I used to, but I stopped doing it years ago, as I couldn't find my voice. Perhaps because he lacked the knowledge of who it belonged to. Now, the voice belongs completely to him, and he has the right and the obligation to use it truthfully." Iris nodded, but didn't speak. She looked at the perfectly trimmed boxwoods, and then at the sky, which was beginning to clear. "Do you think, Monsieur Poirot, that she felt guilty?" Poirot took a few seconds to answer. "No, Lady Agatha felt duty, but in her final days that duty turned to remorse, and remorse is a very clumsy way to love." In the library, Poirot gathered his papers. The folder everyone had mentioned, full of secrets, never appeared. Perhaps it had been destroyed by Lady Agatha herself. Perhaps it had only been a myth. But in its place, Poirot kept the typewritten note she never signed. The one acknowledging Iris as heir, that document, and the testimony of Arling the lawyer would be enough to open the legal inheritance. But Poirot knew that true justice rarely coincided with that rendered by the courts. Reverend Pratt entered at that moment, his expression serene. "Iris asked me to bless Lady Agatha's room before she leaves. Do you think places keep memories, my father? I think people project it onto themselves. And sometimes forgiveness creeps into the back of their minds when no one expects it." Poirot nodded. "Then bless her, not for what she was, but for what she almost became." At 5 o'clock sharp, the black car waiting for Poirot rolled down the gravel road. Barnes, with his usual discretion, handed him a package wrapped in cream-coloured paper. "He left it in your room this morning, monsieur. We don't know from whom." Poirot examined it once inside the car. When he opened it, he found a loose pearl. Just one. Inside, a note. Someone took it off the necklace. Someone thought it was the centre. But it wasn't. It never was. Was not signed. Poirot smiled slightly. Ah, loose pearls, like sins, like truths that don't fit together. And as the carriage pulled away from Thornwick Hall, Hercule Poirot closed his eyes. In his mind, everything had fallen into place. Not with a bang, not with fury, but with the implacable calm of deduction. Chapter 10. The Echo of the Small Grey Cells. 3 weeks after his departure from Thornwick Hall, Hercule Poirot found himself in his London apartment, meticulously arranging a tray of Belgian desserts sent by the chef of his favourite Mayfair restaurant. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the glass, and the air smelled of old books and lemon. It was an afternoon dedicated to contemplation, like so many others. But this one in particular had a shadow. On his desk, neatly lined up, were 3 things: Lady Agatha's typed letter, the loose pearl, and a blank sheet of paper. Poirot looked at the empty sheet of paper as if it contained a confession yet to be revealed. Sometimes, he murmured, the answers lie not in the facts, but in the echoes. She lifted the pearl and held it up to the light. It wasn't particularly valuable, but its significance went beyond gold or prestige. It had been intentionally placed in her room. Someone was telling her something, but not as a sign of threat. It wasn't a message from the killer. It was an act of conscience. He took his pen and wrote 2 words on the blank sheet of paper. Case closed. But he didn't underline it. Something didn't fit. That same night, he received an unexpected visitor. Evelyn March appeared at his door wearing a dark coat soaked by the rain. She carried a folder under her arm and had the face of someone who had slept badly for many nights. Poirot, without showing surprise, invited her in. He offered her a chair and a cup of tea, which she declined. "I had to bring this to you," he said, placing the folder on the table. "I found it hidden behind the fireplace in my room at Thornwick. I didn't know what to do at first. I thought about destroying it, then keeping it, but I can't live with what's in it." Poirot leaned towards the folder without opening it. Yes, the famous folder, Lady Agatha's, with her notes, her copies of letters, the documents about Iris, about Philip, about me. Everything's there. And also an unsent letter. Poirot took it out. The handwriting was unmistakable, Lady Agatha's strong hand, though more shaky than usual. The date, 2 days before her death. "Dear Iris, I failed to be fair to you, or to your mother. My obsession with order and correctness blinded me to compassion. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I can offer the truth. In the folder that accompanies this letter, you'll find what I hid, not just documents. Also, the history that was denied, to me and that now, can belong to you. You decide whether you want to carry it or release it. With regret, Agatha C. Evelyn looked away. She was going to hand it over, but she didn't. Something stopped her. Poirot nodded slowly. "And now, mademoiselle, you have done the right thing. It doesn't exonerate me. I contributed to his death. Even though I didn't. Spray the poison. I caused it. Yes, but it also brought light. And that act, though belated, is a step toward redemption." Evelyn stood up. "What will you do with the folder?" "Nothing for now. Iris will decide. She has the right to choose what to do with her story." Evelyn nodded and left, lighter, although still with rain in her eyes. 2 days later, Poirot sent a letter by registered mail to New York. It was addressed to a simple address, a small apartment on the Upper West Side, where Iris Lane had decided to settle after her return. Inside the envelope, there was no explanation, just 3 things: Lady Agatha's final letter, the folder, and the loose pearl. In the accompanying note, Poirot wrote, "A broken chain can be reformed, but only if each new link is consciously chosen, with respect and hope. H.P." That same evening, in his London apartment, Poirot gazed at his reflection in the mirror. Not out of vanity, but out of habit. He adjusted his moustache, straightened his tie, and spoke in a low voice. "Order has been restored, not in the way Lady Agatha wished, but in the only way that could last." He turned on a Bakelite radio, played a Chopin nocturne, and sat by the window with his cup of chamomile tea. Rain kept falling, but inside, as in the closed case of the necklace that did not touch the neck, everything was, finally, in its place. And the little grey cells, satisfied, rested for the night. Chapter 11. The Last Note. Winter began to creep into London with a cold breath that scratched the windows and drove passers-by to wrap themselves in heavier coats. It was a November afternoon when Hercule Poirot received the reply he had been waiting for. He expected it not in the form of a letter or a telegram, but as a simple package with no return address, wrapped in thick paper and a pale blue ribbon. He opened it with the delicacy he reserved for everything important. Inside, he found a black-covered notebook, a handwritten note, and a single loose leaf with a sentence written in blue ink. "You can't change the past, but you can tell it fairly." Poirot sat down immediately. The notebook was filled with firm, clear writing without any erasures. He recognized that handwriting. It was Iris Lane's. He began to read. "This notebook is not a novel, nor is it a confession. It is a story that was denied to me, and that I now choose to tell, not for revenge, but to understand. Lady Agatha Carmichael wasn't a villain. She was an architect of order, a woman who confused control with love. In her own way, she tried to make amends for what she had done to my mother, and to others as well. Philip wasn't her victim. He was her mirror. Evelyn, her echo. Lydia, her consequence. And I am the reminder of everything he wanted to erase. But I am also, now, something more. I'm a Carmichael without a collar, and that's enough for me." Poirot closed the notebook. He allowed himself a moment of silence, then walked to his bookshelf and placed the notebook between two volumes, Spinoza's Ethics and Rousseau's Confessions, right where I placed the documents that weren't evidence, but human truths. Weeks later, Iris Lane published her first book. It wasn't fiction, nor did it have a fancy title. It was simply called The Thornwick Hall Notebook. It was published by a small but prestigious publishing house, and the dedication simply said, "To those who inherit stories they didn't ask for, to those who choose to rewrite them with dignity." Poirot received a signed copy. He kept it on his bedside table next to his pocket watch and leather diary. He didn't read it immediately. He didn't need to. He already knew the story. What mattered to him was that at last, I knew her too. One day, while having tea with Mrs. Oliver, the eccentric novelist and occasional deductive friend, Poirot briefly mentioned the case of the necklace. A necklace that didn't touch the neck. "That's a fabulous title for a novel," she exclaimed, dropping 2 sugar cubes into her cup without looking at them. It was symbolic, I suppose. Poirot smiled, like everything worthwhile. a gesture more eloquent than any physical evidence. It wasn't just a jewel. It was a symbol of authority and of rupture. "And justice? Justice," said Poirot, looking into his cup, "is not always meted out in a court of law. Sometimes it simply happens when a person takes their truth and puts it in writing. And the murderer? He was discovered. He confessed. He paid. And you, Poirot, placed the cup on the saucer with perfect precision. I only helped the truths to find each other." That evening, as he drew the curtains and carefully adjusted the bedspread on his bed, Poirot allowed himself one last reflection. Lady Agatha had wanted to control her story until the end, but in dying, he had unknowingly left room for another to begin. And in that space, halfway between justice, forgiveness, and narrative, rose the figure of a young woman, without a necklace, without permission, but with a voice, the small grey cells, completely satisfied, rested, and the echo of the crime, for the first time, was not a whisper of shadows, but the soft sound of a page being turned. Chapter 12. The Inverted Necklace. In December, London was adorned with warm lights and festive window displays. The streets vibrated with a hurried energy, wrapped in scarves and the scent of roasted chestnuts. In his apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot observed the outside world with a slight frown. He detested the clutter of the Christmas crowds, but he loved the symbolism of the end of a cycle. It was on one of those evenings that he received an unexpected visitor. Lydia Carmichael, dressed in simple elegance and a grey wool coat, appeared unannounced at his door. Poirot, with his usual precision, greeted her courteously and invited her to sit by the softly crackling gas stove. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, "I haven't come for answers. We already know them. I've come for closure." Poirot inclined his head. "I'm listening, madam." Lydia held between her fingers a silver medallion hanging from a thin chain. "Lady Agatha gave this to me when I married Jonathan. She said, sometimes what is hidden in the jewel is more valuable than its appearance. I never understood the phrase. But this week, when I accidentally opened the locket, I found a hidden miniature." He handed her the object. Inside was a tiny hand-painted photograph. A young woman with Iris's face. Not exactly her, but her clear reflection. It was Margaret Carmichael, the exiled sister. Poirot nodded slowly. "So, she did have her sister with her all this time?" "I think so, and I also think Lady Agatha wasn't as inhuman as we tried to paint her after her death. Just cowardly human." "Exactly, madam. The crime wasn't born of absolute evil, but of the fear of losing power over other people's narratives. Lady Agatha was neither a murderer nor a victim. She was the stage where others acted out their wounds." Lydia stared at the stove. Her eyes were lost in the flames. "Do you think Iris will forgive her?" "I don't know. But I do know that writing is an act of reconciliation, even when it doesn't seem like it. Your book is the beginning of something Lady Agatha couldn't finish, and perhaps silently longed to begin." Lydia stood up to leave. Poirot escorted her to the door. Before leaving, she turned around. "And you, Monsieur Poirot? How do you live with all the truths you discover?" "In order, madam, and with herbal teas, the soul also needs to be digested slowly. That same evening, Poirot decided to visit the only place that still held a shadow of the case in his memory: the Victoria and Albert Museum's jewellery gallery. There, in a secondary room, a collection of family necklaces belonging to the English aristocracy was on display. He wasn't looking for a jewel, but for an idea. In front of a glass case, Poirot pondered Lady Agatha's necklace. He hadn't been poisoned. He hadn't been robbed. He just wasn't where he should have been, like Iris. The necklace didn't touch her neck because it represented something Lady Agatha could no longer hold: her control over the family's destiny. The gesture of setting it aside wasn't the killer's, as had been initially believed. It was Lady Agatha's. Perhaps she sensed the betrayal. Perhaps she felt the poison weakening her. And in that last moment of lucidity, she withdrew it herself, as a symbol, as a final act of surrender, not to give up, but to free. Poirot closed his eyes. The necklace, he murmured, was not a sign of power, but of renunciation. Back home, he allowed himself to write one last note in his case notebook. Case, the book necklace that didn't touch the neck. Crime committed with double intention, Evelyn March. Emotional impulse, failed poisoning. Philip Carmichael, practical execution, final dose. Reason, fear of losing legacy, generational frustration. Victim, not only Lady Agatha, but also the family history distorted by silence. Final solution, Iris Lane receives the fortune, but the truth. Personal note, justice, when it is psychological, doesn't need judges, only memory and clarity. He closed the notebook. He turned off the lamp, and while the city continued to shine outside, Poirot leaned back with a faint smile. His little grey cells were resting, not because the world was in order, but because chaos had spoken, and he had listened to him.